Okay, so welcome everybody to this chat and all the people who will watch this after we have long stopped laughing after this moment. This is part of the Summer SoulCon series. I have to be completely honest and say that I had a really hard time coming up with a title for this, which maybe is a good description of how this time in general feels. But what eventually I settled on is Making Media as We Go, a discussion on social media and pop culture by BIPOC and Cutie Talk. So that's obviously a super big thing, and we'll kind of take that apart throughout our discussion. But also this discussion welcomes all anecdotes, tangents, and things that are perceived as being potentially off topic, because we don't need to worry about being on topic because we're in a pandemic. So anything and everything is fair game for discussion in my mind. So to introduce myself really quickly, I am Katlin, or Katie. I go by she, her, AF pronouns. I am a PhD student at the Ohio State University and in the Department of English, and I am part of Laser and SoulCon at Ohio State. So we're going to do some introductions of the beautiful, wonderful friends who are on this panel. We might be joined by one Korie Houston if he wakes up in time for this chat. If not, you still get to see a beautiful picture of him regardless. So first we have Christian Hines. Christian, tell the people a little bit about yourself.
I'm also a PhD student in the program of literature for children and young adults. I work at a middle school as a reading coordinator for the Bell National Resource Center. I'm stationed in the Department of Teaching and Learning as a graduate assistant, and I attend the lovely Ohio State University.
Yes, they very much care about their fee.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I get corrected often. The Ohio State University. I'm like, okay, Buckeyes, whatever. But yeah.
A beautiful picture of Korie Houston. Gotta love him. Hopefully he'll join us. Whether he does or does not, he is over at UC San Diego's LGBT Resource Center and is their Programs and Operations Coordinator, which then takes us to B.
Hi, everyone. My name is B López. My pronouns are they, them. I'm a PhD student in composition and cultural rhetoric at Syracuse University, and I am a writing instructor.
Fantastic. And then last but certainly not least, we have Quincy Sharp.
Hello, I'm Quincy. My pronouns are she, her. I am a mother, but I'm so much more than that. So I'm a former CSUSM student. I was a math major for 8 years. During that time, I was a tutor on campus for about 4 years. I became the student coordinator at the GEC, which is the Gender Equity Center, formerly known as the Women's Center. We started focusing more on gender equality, gender politics. Our campus even hosted like a parenting corner that I started running myself because I was a student parent. And so we advocated for mothers on campus. After that, I never got my degree, but I'm still working on it, but just give me some time. I worked in a domestic violence house. I ran that for about 2 years. That was really exciting and very informative. I moved out here to Ohio. I've been a math tutor for about 8 years. So if you ever need me. And during the COVID pandemic, thankfully and unfortunately, I've been an essential worker. So it's been a pull between being thankful and being distressed and anxiety ridden and depressed over it all. So it's been an interesting time, but I'm here and I'm thankful to be a part of this panel.
Thanks, y'all. And thank you once again for being here, because I appreciate just like y'all just donating your time, but also your energy in this time that I feel like really, as we were talking about before this, feels like this just consistently, but also just, I think that like each day we have different news that comes to us. And I think that that makes it really challenging to keep kind of like, I don't know, I keep looking at my planner and being like, who is she? Because I used to know her and now it just seems like that planner is becoming obsolete. So I really appreciate you all being here to kind of talk through like, I don't know, for lack of a better word, just like stuff related to kind of our existences right now. And so as I was kind of talking to you all about kind of what we might, I don't know, what we might talk about within the context of this session, I kind of came across a couple of things that I tried to organize into a snapshot. So mostly thinking about the ways in which BIPOC and QTPOC folks imagine and create radical futures. And radical is a term that gets co-opted, so I think it's useful to talk about that. But imagining futures that, are thinking about building community, making media, and engaging in discourse throughout social media and popular culture. I think also it's important to be thinking about ourselves as creators, but also creators who make use of social media pages and profiles, multicultural and anti-racist children's literature, and technologies like cell phones and video calling that allow us to even talk to each other right now, but more generally. And just thinking about how all of those things collectively allow us to generate sustainable community care, empowerment, and consciousness raising. And so with all of that being said, I think that one of the kind of main focuses for today is thinking about how social media and pop culture that's created by and for BIPOC and QTPOC has that ability to kind of effectively push back against and overcome limitations imposed by corporations and institutions, right, which have historically owned and weaponized these spaces to uphold white supremacy, capitalism, and ableist heteropatriarchy, none of which are things that happen lightly and none of which are things that happen with disruption, right? These are ongoing, just like wellness and just justice issues that I think are all embedded in this talk today as we think about social media and pop culture. So with that being said, the first kind of section that I've prepared for us or flagged, and again, you are welcome to kind of respond to the, question sandwiches I've prepared for you in any way that you wish, whether it's the whole thing, whether it's just a little nugget of it, whatever makes your heart happy. But starting with kind of social media and pages and profiles, the kind of first cluster of questions I have for you is just thinking about big picture things related to social media. So first and foremost, have you felt that your behaviors on social media or just even your feelings about social media have evolved at all during the pandemic? Are you finding that you're scrolling a lot more or you're on your devices more to stay in contact with people you care about or to be updated on the news? And I wondered too, just more broadly, what your thoughts are about social media in terms of, does it fit, what content gets produced there? Do you feel like it fits into existing conversations about social justice, community building, representation that happens in spaces like film, TV, and literature? Or do you feel like social media is kind of its own thing that's totally separate from those spheres? And thinking about all of these spheres in the context of again, film studios, TV networks, corporations, and just publishing. So a lot of things that are at the wall right now, but I wonder, how are you feeling about social media? But what are your thoughts about social media as something that exists? So anybody who wants to jump in, take it away.
I'll jump in. During the pandemic, I haven't been very active on social media, personal reasons. I just like to live my life. And I've learned as I got older to be more private is actually better for your mental health. So I don't post a lot anyways. I usually just repost something. I don't put my opinion out there. And during the pandemic, I run a makeup page on Instagram, and I've noticed I've definitely stopped posting my own makeup looks because I feel like it's taking away from what's going on. And I know there was that blackout day on social media, which was supposed to be a good cause, but it actually turned out to be a very bad cause because it really blacked out what was happening with the protests and, just everyday police interactions with Black people or people of color. And so it really took away from what we were trying to do with our message for Black Lives Matters and just the fight that we're going through right now on top of our pandemic. And so I definitely have stepped away from social media and putting my own opinion out there, unless, something completely rubs me wrong. But I don't put my pictures selfies or enjoying. There's not much to enjoy. You can't go out right now. You're not supposed to be going out right now. So there's not much to be posting for me right now. So the pandemic definitely changed how I presented myself to whoever's following me. I did participate in the blackout day, but once I realized this doesn't make sense, I looked at the hashtags and I realized what was actually happening. I deleted it immediately. I was just this isn't necessarily the way I want to go about doing the most that I can as activism. There's better ways to go about it than just blacking out people's stories for the day. So I definitely think the pandemic changed that for me.
I think for me, it's kind of been Sort of the same things that Q said, but I think my social media involvement has been coming in different waves. So at the beginning of the pandemic, I was more on there like trying to get information because, of course, like people didn't know what was going on. And when they were doing shelter in place, like there were arguments of like, are they going to shut state borders down? How are people going to be able to travel? What's that going to look like? So I remember constantly being on Twitter, like looking at the news, looking at the governor post updates, trying to see what happened. And then there was this shift after George Floyd was murdered, and then they were showing the protest. So then it became, okay, well, I'm looking at people post stuff on Twitter, and then for me, it was like reposting stuff, like kind of like activism, like reposting other people's posts, talking about like Black Lives Matter. What does anti-racism look like? What does performative allyship look like? And then I remember like for the whole month of June, it was like repost, 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 repost. And then thinking about like social justice in social media and how people were doing all these things that you either saw them posting all the time or you didn't see them posting at all. And so then it became this whole argument of like, why aren't people posting? Why are they being quiet? And then it went from let's talk about activism to like us calling people out on their silence. And for me, it got to be very anxiety ridden because we had all this negative news and now we're fighting, but we're taking attention away from the bigger issue at hand. And we should be, if we're going to use this platform, we should be using it for that issue at hand. So like looking from when the pandemic started in March to where we went April, May, June, and even where we are in July, like it has been a constant, like every month is different, at least for me in social media and looking at how I interact. Like I don't post at all anymore. And once again, now it's only just like reposting like informational stuff, especially like anti-racism in the classroom and things like that. But I had to get off Twitter because it was wreaking havoc with my anxiety. People were just there to argue at this point right now. And it's just been a lot of like nonsense and vitriol. So I had to pull back for a while because it was upsetting me. So that's been like my big picture social media.
Yeah, I think kind of similarly. I started off first being on it a lot more and constantly scrolling and then resharing, sharing resources, things like that. And then I think just I started to get really exhausted, not just from resharing but then sharing these resources, but then always constantly having these conversations outside of like social media. So I stopped resharing as much. And then in general, I think I just stopped posting on social media. I think I posted pretty frequently before the pandemic, but then just, I don't know, I think just sometime like last month, I just stopped. It's just been really exhausting being on social media. And I usually use social media to write and kind of journal in a way. So I miss that aspect, but it's just, I've been trying to create space for myself outside of it because it's been draining, just emotionally, mentally. It's just been a lot, but yeah.
Yeah, I definitely feel a very similar way to what all of y'all have spoken to of just like trying to figure out when I have the energy to do certain activities feels very different in this moment because we are doing so much of it through a screen in a lot of cases. And I think that definitely in sort of that like 2-week period where there was actual kind of mainstream media coverage of George Floyd's murder and substantially like less given to Tony McDade and Breonna Taylor, right? And like many other folks.
Elijah.
Yeah, and Elijah, right? Like so many people that it's been sort of complicated too, I think, in seeing sort of whose murders have been paid attention to in what ways and sort of how that almost seemed to also come up in sort of like my Instagram feed and like my Twitter and my Facebook of just sometimes feeling really conflicted of like in what moments do I like try to navigate sort of what will be most productive and at what point is what I'm posting or responding to people, you know, kind of almost besides the point, right? And so I wonder about like in thinking about the ways in which we all have personal profiles, I wonder, and you all kind of spoken to this a bit with Twitter, but kind of before this moment, but also in this moment, I'm curious about sort of what social media platforms that you find that you maintain an active profile on. And if you find that you do produce or post kind of original content of things that you've made alongside some of this reposting, like I feel like I've been seeing more and more people share like poetry that they've written or zines that they've put together or other things that they've created. And I wonder if you have used your social media at any point, but even now, as sort of a place to do that, like when B was talking about kind of journaling in some ways. And I wonder also as well, like thinking about something kind of back to what Christian said even before this call, of just thinking about like our professional lives and our personal lives and how social media kind of interacts with that. I wonder what you think is like the extent to which your personal social media presence impacts your relationships and politics and interests in your day-to-day life. And if you feel like you're the same person off screen that you are on screen. Because I think that for some of us who have family or who have like that one uncle or that colleague or whoever it might be that's sort of mixed into these other networks that we have and then they're all consolidated in social media, I wonder if you find yourself ever making adjustments to your behavior either online or in person.
Can I add one last thing to the last little bit? So everyone mentioned, I mean, it was such a good amount of responses. It was pandemic response, it was Black Lives Matters response, it was George Floyd. So I remember in the beginning of the pandemic where I didn't have to worry about seeing Black people murdered for no reason. It was refreshing. It was, you know, you didn't have to see school shootings every other week. You didn't have to see mass attacks on people of color of any type of sort. It was very calm, but that's not to say that it wasn't happening. That's just to say that people weren't out in the public to be able to record it, which it's very unsettling, but it was still like a refresh for me being a Black woman, having to see the trauma every single day of knowing mothers and fathers and wives and kids are going through this, missing their people. So I do remember feeling kind of at ease a little bit in the beginning of the pandemic because I could just focus on COVID. I could just focus on not going to the store, you know, wearing my mask, putting gloves on. I was still working, so sanitizing my work area every
watching Tiger King. I remember that was your
It was amazing. It was amazing. So there was definitely that disconnect for me as a Black person being in America, having to worry about a whole different type of pandemic outside of racism, because that's what I have to deal with on a daily basis anyways. So then to go to my social media, my personal, my, you know, whatever type of public image that I do want to portray, say for like my makeup page, I definitely recognize the difference in my friends posting. I could see that people from my past, people from my present, they were posting stuff either on one side or the complete opposite side. So I know that if I say something, it's going to rub somebody the wrong way. Now, personally, I don't care. People need to be rubbed the wrong way at this point in time. If you still feel a right to be racist, if you still feel a right to hold on to the Confederate symbol, or you still feel a right to claim Blue Lives Matters when Blue Lives aren't a real thing, then I've learned to silence myself in that moment. I've seen a lot of people be more vocal about it. A lot of my Black friends who knew these, you know, white people who are now changing their stance in life, they've been more vocal, but I don't feel the energy anymore to fight that fight to teach somebody about racism and how they are wrong and how they make me feel. If you can't see it, it's not, I don't feel like it's my personal burden to teach you. I feel like it's someone else's burden to teach you. You should learn yourself. There's Google, there's ways to immerse yourself in understanding empathy for somebody else outside of your race, outside of your gender, outside of your culture, outside of your religion. There's no reason for us to have empathy for our oppressors when they do wrong, and yet it doesn't go the same way. So on social media posts, I definitely notice myself taking my voice out of it because I'm just tired of arguing, and I don't feel like I need to be attacked anymore as a Black person. And especially like in this heat of the moment, I'm exhausted. I'm exhausted from just watching it. So imagine how I feel about talking about it and posting it out of my own words. You know, there's just so much we can do as the victims of this systematic racism, on top of the systematic racism with the pandemic, because no one's really even talking about that either. the lack of care towards Black patients, the lack of, oh, you're fine, just go home, towards not even just Black patients, anybody who's not white. Let's just say that. So there's layers upon layers with this pandemic. And once George Floyd happened, the racism just kind of opened right back up. So now I have to feel even more pressure going out. It's definitely more of a police state here in Columbus. And being a Black person, when a cop gets behind me, I don't feel safe. I never felt safe, but now it's just even more heightened, I guess. So social media, I've taken myself out of it because I'm tired of arguing it. I'm just trying to live peacefully. And I think it's somebody else's fight at this point.
To some extent, I'm kind of on the same thinking system as you, but I am actually more vocal. So with my social media, and it depends because social media, Twitter and Instagram are two different spaces and how you interact in their spaces. So Twitter, I feel, because it's more real time, they do more like real time thoughts and rants and consume with public opinion. So you can say something and have all the best intent and people will jump in your comments and your mentions and it could go completely the wrong way. So, and we've all seen that, like even before this pandemic, but now it's just like everyone is so offended by what you say or try to like break down what you say. So I'm more on, I go to Twitter, I scroll through Twitter. I'm a viewer on Twitter. I'm a participant on Instagram. So I feel like when I going through the social media and looking at my personal profile, I was kind of going through like the different stages of grief because I was depressed and I was angry and then I was in denial. But right now I've just been sitting in anger as I started watching people, especially people that I know. And your question about how does it, like, to what extent does it impact your relationships and your personal lives? For me, being a educator and a graduate student, it impacted my personal life directly because people who are colleagues, classmates, educators who kind of like what you said, they're on opposite sides. Either you were for everything or you're silent. And for me, being an educator and watching other educators and classmates be silent on issues of this, especially people who you're sitting with in class and they're advocating for equity and access and diversity, and they say nothing at all, whether it's on social media or in their personal lives. So when I started reposting, it was kind of like, I started with the post like, you can't say you're for Black Lives Matter, but you don't talk to your Black colleagues or you do microaggressions or all of these things. And I started posting those. So then I was like, okay, I want to do more activism in education. So then I made a edu blog on Instagram where I can post resources, where I can post helpful things because I didn't want to be combative, but I still wanted to continuously call out and call in these actions because they're not okay. And for me, not only being a Black person, being an educator, if you're doing this to other adults, I can only imagine what it's like to be a child in your classroom and have you in authority over me. So I feel like I have to say something because I have to let you know that it's not okay. So in the event that you do get in front of a child, you won't perpetuate this same behavior. So that has impacted a lot of my relationships. Some of my classmates, we've had discussions and I've had to tell them, I will not address you unless it is academically involved because you don't practice what you preach, and I can't co-sign to that at all. In good conscience, being who I am, being out here putting my life on the line every day. Like you said, every time a cop gets behind me, I literally blink, reach for my phone, and pray that they're either going to switch lanes and turn or that I'll make it home. So if I have to live with that every day, I don't think it's okay for you to sit there in silence and act like nothing's happening and wait for this to roll over. So a lot of my relationships have, well, at least my relationships with white people have changed because of this, because watching them sit through their silence or process their guilt, but not process their guilt by centering themselves and not the people who are actually being disserviced, being impacted, and being marginalized.
That's so powerful.
Yeah, I before the just like the sharing of just like the protest rhetoric online, everything just happening in terms of like the the visibility of just like racism and everything that happened with George Floyd. Before all of this, like I was fighting to get funding for BIPOC in my in my program. And so I've been seeing these white folks around me silent, people in my program, faculty. And so I try not to have them even on my social media. So I think that I'm just curious how they would react if they were to see what I post on social media, because the most active platform I have is my Instagram. So I have some people on there on my Facebook, but I really don't use it ever really. It's kind of random when I do, but I keep my profile active for Instagram, and I post most of my things on there. But I'm definitely thinking I should get a Twitter, because I don't care about who reads my stuff. And I think that it's limited on Instagram since it's private. Certain people can't view my things. So I would love for white folks in my program to see my stuff, but they're most likely not going to unless they're stalking in some way. But
Twitter is amazing.
I need to get it. I tried. I really tried. I have a fake one for just game and nonsense, but I need to get one so I could just post about things that, because I write in my Instagram, I kind of journal in a way, but it's not as maybe timely as Twitter would be. So a lot of the times when I'm sharing what I believe or just calling folks out on Instagram, it's definitely not as in the moment as maybe Twitter would be. So I think if anything, I feel like Instagram has allowed me to share resources and information about Black trans folks, is I feel like those conversations are definitely erased. I mean, I have like my small community on Instagram of folks who we share the same kind of information, but it's like a small group of friends that I have who share these things. Then most of the rhetoric is around the same folks who have been talked about, right? Which is fine, definitely valid, of course. Talk about George Floyd, but there are so many Black trans folks who are being erased on the daily and whose experiences have been erased before the pandemic. And so that's mostly what the kind of content I try to reshare and talk about. If anything, it's been helpful to find other folks who kind of have these similar conversations, and just trying to build community, because there's a handful of us out here where I'm at. So that's what my profiles allow me to do, is connect with folks who I'm like, okay, y'all are doing the work. Let's build this like online community, stay in contact with each other. Yeah.
You should definitely go to Twitter. I think you'll definitely find your community. They are there.
Yeah.
They have been basically trying to burn down the walls.
It's been so satisfying.
It is, and it's not even just, it's scholars. And I also love it because it's also a lot of authors, a lot of white authors. They've been pitchforks raised about amplifying trans voices, LGBTQ, all of that, Black voices. So I think you should definitely join Twitter. You will definitely find your space. And there's a lot of like scholars, like abolitionist scholars that are now speaking out. And they have this like hashtag movement called like Liberate and Chill. And they've been doing a lot of really good work that I think you would love and you should absolutely be a part of.
And then also to speak on the fact that like we really didn't mention Facebook a lot. We mentioned Twitter and Instagram. So Facebook, I feel like, is the social media that's very personal. And to put it out in your personal life is much more traumatizing, most likely, because you even have, I mean, even as a Black person, I have family members who won't like me posting Black Lives Matters, who won't like me posting these police videos, who are cops and think like, oh, I'm your cousin. Do you think you should be? Yeah. I mean, are you speaking up against the issue, or are you falling back into the Blue Lives Matter rhetoric? Are you silencing this problem, you know? So I feel like Facebook is something that's very personal to people, that's the most vulnerable you can be in social media and like expressing your opinion. Twitter is amazing because nobody cares about who you are. If they like what you say, they're going to repost it, and you like, it does not matter. And there's so many people on there who's willing to combat you. And the I'm not even saying that it's just right-wing people. Left-wing people are batshit crazy too. I'm not gonna deny it. So it's very interesting to see the arguments on these different platforms. Instagram is more pretty and powerful, and I'm gonna make a statement. Twitter is the late night crap you don't want your parents to see, and Facebook is what you're presenting on Sunday morning. So there's very different personalities that come with these different social medias. And I will definitely say Twitter, with the pandemic, with Black Lives Matters, with everything that's going on, Indigenous people, with ICE, I will always be more informed with the real, with the raw, with the stuff you don't want to see, not the pretty stuff that MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, all these places put out there. Oh, this is what we're going to make the story into. Twitter hits you with that, oh my God, did I just see that? Oh, shit. So, but I thought it was interesting how all three of our responses so far has kind of like distanced ourselves from the Facebook, because Facebook is more so like, man, you could cut off a lot of people that you really care about. And I don't think we're willing to get to that point yet. Like, I've seen people that I really care about, white people, and to see how they justify their notions on, well, you all shouldn't be rioting and you're just tearing down public property. It's like, you used to find comfort and safety in our culture. And so the fact that you are changing this and turning it into a Black versus white issue versus more than like, it is a Black versus white issue. It's a white versus everybody issue, let's say. But in this specific moment, it's just a human against human issue. You can't even argue that someone can't violate someone's civil rights, human rights, take away a life, and no repercussions are done. And you can't expect anger from people who could see that happening to themselves. If this were completely flipped and it was white people being unbelievably murdered at an unbelievable rate, there would be no question about White Lives Matter. There would be no question about white protests in the street with their American flags, their Confederate flags, whatever they want to claim as their culture, So the fact that it is being so minimalized for anybody else's culture and race and sexuality or gender or performance or just livelihood, it's just very, it's interesting how loud it is on certain social media platforms versus how more private and concealed it is on Facebook.
And I also think it's a...
Go ahead, Christian.
Sorry, Katie.
Go ahead.
You made me think of there was a meme that was going around, like, not even just like the personal part of Facebook, but like even the age gap. So they were like, when you look at Twitter's like being on the block in real time. Instagram is 3 business days later, and Facebook weeks and still processing. So by the time they've caught up, everyone has moved on to something else, because it's like, oh, now my parents, my grandparents, your aunties finally realize what I was saying, but we've moved on.
Yeah, we don't have time to explain it to you. Keep up with the movement, or like, just like don't criticize the youth for our movements and how we move about it. Like, you all had your time. It's literally our time to fight. It's interesting the age gap though. You're so right about that, Christian. Like, good Lord, they do not get it until much later. Like, did you see this meme? Oh, good Lord, we're on a whole different issue. There's a whole different hashtag right now.
We've moved on. It's over. We're moved on. Catch up.
That makes me think though too. I have to, if I'm being honest, right? And obviously, so the SoulCon Summer Series is something that's available to whoever wants to watch it, right? So that we're kind of almost in some ways experiencing this right now, of like speaking on things that we feel about, and sort of then it goes out into the world, much like Twitter, and less so like Facebook and Instagram, right? And sort of can be viewed, consumed, whatever. And as you all were talking, I was thinking about the ways in which I have to admit that Twitter really is my kind of one step of consultation for me when I'm thinking about sort of who's in my network, because I have definitely found, whether it's a scholar or like somebody who does social commentary on YouTube, like Richicano Chisme, or just like folks who like are engaging in these discourses, I definitely have found that the likelihood of somebody responding on Twitter, right, almost just feels way more possible than emailing somebody or making something and then maybe they eventually see it. And the reason why that sticks out in my mind is like, there have been so many times when I'm like, wow, I really like this scholar because I really like something they said and on a like panel, or I really enjoyed this book or this book that they wrote, like explained a concept for me. And then I see their Twitter and their Twitter is remarkably silent on things in the moment. And I have to admit, it does in some ways shape kind of my processing of sort of who they are beyond kind of these prepared speeches or documents or whatever, because I do think there's something about Twitter where you are getting sort of that almost instantaneous knee-jerk reaction. And that can be really complicated, right? Because sometimes we get people's reactions and it's like, ooh, put it back, right? Or like process for another like 10 minutes or a couple hours. But I think a lot of the times Twitter then becomes almost this portal of like seeing or coming into contact with people at other universities or in other states or places that we wouldn't have contact with them potentially otherwise. And I think that when I think about my Instagram, right, it's almost like we're preparing things for different audiences, because I think like with Facebook, I've got people there from kindergarten to now, right? Whereas like Instagram and Twitter, I have less of that and more so people I've kind of met later on. And I think part of that comes from the fact that I've had Facebook the longest, but also like Quincy's right, there is a way in which Facebook kind of is familial in a way that almost kind of makes it that when I post things, even though I still post exactly what I think, I definitely think the way I frame it is definitely very different. Whereas with Twitter, I'm reposting things a lot of the times too. And I think that sometimes my retweeting on Twitter is coming from a place of like, I am learning, I think it's Adrienne Keene who has the blog Native Appropriations. And she talks about like, you know, consenting to learn publicly and like learning things as you go, as opposed to just sort of like trying to always present this image of like, I've known everything this whole time, because people don't get anything from that either, right? Like a lot of my, I think social awakening has come from social media and from learning from people, many of whom are not in the university at all, and being like, oh, that makes way more sense than like these 40 pages that I had to read for a seminar that like I maybe skimmed through or whatever it might be. And so on that note, we started to get to this in the last kind of round, but I'm wondering about when you think about who you follow or what you follow, like what kinds of social media pages and creators are you following? And what kinds of like media or discourse are they like producing, like podcasts or literature? I know that B obviously loves Olok. I also love them. I think they're great. I included some here of people that I kind of thought of right away of like, okay, yeah, these are people that I follow because they make jewelry that I like, or poetry or posters or whatever. So I just wonder if you all can maybe think about like, who am I following or what do I follow? It doesn't have to be specific, but like what content do I find that I'm really engaging with, whether it's like commenting or reposting or even just like, you know, the little like that you get on Instagram or Facebook, or I guess Twitter too.
I do a lot of scholars like on Instagram. So they have Teachergram. So I do a lot of Teachergrams that I follow, and a lot of like artists. I do comic book artists and regular like picture book artists. So on Instagram, kind of, I think Quincy said it, like it's more pretty on Instagram. So Instagram is like it's my visual. So a lot of people that I follow, especially when it comes to like the Teachergrams, like there's this one it's called Lit Circle, and she does a lot of flyers and graphics about like decolonizing the curriculum, and they're very eye-catching. So I follow a lot of accounts like that. On Twitter, it's more of a lot of scholars and PhD students, because I like to like retweet their quotes, retweet their tweets, what they're doing. And a lot of them lately, especially with everyone talking about like anti-racism and abolitionist teaching, like I follow like, I think it's Cody Miller, like Shay the Scholar, Dulcie Fletcher, like they all are in that Liberate and Chill movement, and kind of following them and retweeting them. But then I also do a lot of podcasts. So there's this podcast that I follow that I feel like encapsulates my personality. It's called Ratchet and Respectable. So my Twitter is both ratchet and respectable. Yes, so I follow a lot of ratchet things, but I also follow and retweet a lot of respectable things. And then like that podcast, and then The Read, which is a phenomenal, like Kid Fury and Crystal West, like I follow them because they talk about a lot of ratchet things, but they talk about a lot of political things. And I feel like it's important because it's informational and it's still relatable. So I feel like Twitter for me is that ratchet and respectable, and then Instagram is that visual, informational type culture. And then, I mean, we didn't really mention this, I really thought about this, but YouTube, I still use YouTube, but I do it more for BookTube. I do BookTube a lot. I love BookTube. So doing like looking at author interviews and reader reviews and like quick little shows like that. So that's kind of like my BookTube is like my bookish side. So we got Ratchet and Respectable, the pretty visuals, and then the bookish. And that's like how my online engagement is like compartmentalized.
Oh, I love it. I love that so much.
Yeah, it's same like Instagram. I follow a lot of artists on there, and I feel like pretty much all the artists I follow, they're all sharing kind of similar things in terms of politics. Like all of their artwork is super political, critiquing the conversations around what's going on. Like Alok I love the things that they post in general, and they're brilliant. Like I actually interviewed them for the podcast I'm a part of, This Rhetorical Life. So that conversation, shameless plug, is going to be coming out soon. And so I had a conversation with them, and it was wild hearing just their thought flow in real life, because everything that they say, I'm just like constantly snapping to in my head, because not only do what they share is just so brilliant, but they're thinking about things in this world that's beyond this very binary world that is just the cis heteronormative world that we're a part of. So I feel like I follow artists that are constantly thinking about the world that exists that isn't respectable, or isn't, it's just a world where like BIPOC trans folks exist and are just living beyond this like very gendered, violent world. I mean, the violence is going to continue regardless, but I think that they're just creating a world helping create a world that's making that possible. And I see that so much in their online postings. Them, and also Migrant Scribble as well, the project Street Series, and Lucify, a bunch of artists that are just sharing dope artwork.
So I love all of your answers. That's so crazy. I follow people. I just follow more so like, I fell out of academia before I got into Twitter, so I never got to like build my following or, find, mentors or just people I would look up to in these types of situations. So really, I'm more of a people person, and I just follow random people just from the makeup community, from colleges, from higher academia, just like the professors, people from the news, congresswomen, congressmen, all of that stuff. So mine's just like a melting pot more so. I follow artists who, create these elaborate, it's just not even one portrait. I've seen so many different, what is it called when it's art and it's just like a collection of it all, right? About one issue. And they make more noise than anybody I've ever heard in a college class or even in like a Congress room where there's just a bunch of powerful people trying to settle laws. Like, if art is so much more expressive and it makes more of an impact, and yet it's still so silenced in these activists and these movements, it's very downplayed. Oh, you're just an artist, you just painted something, who cares? Or you're a musician and you made a song, what is that doing for anybody? You're not really creating change. But for people like me who have fallen out of academia or never even had access to it, it's a way of hearing other people's opinions in the way that they put it. It doesn't have to be so eloquent. It can be very blunt. It can be very harsh, be very raw, and yet you're still learning something from it. And so I follow just everybody. I follow people like me, moms, students, people who are trying to make just the slightest change on our level that we can access. So it's interesting hearing the different people that you all follow being Christian, and even Katie. It's like, I follow a mixture of all that, but I feel like the majority of the people that I follow and I hear a lot of messages from come from people who are like me, who don't really have a platform yet, but still have very powerful statements to say, and they're very much worthy. So like on Twitter, they'll still go big, they'll still get people seeing and hearing their stuff. But in real life, you know, we're just going to work for our 8 hours a day, trying to feed our kids to like keep a roof over our heads. So I think that was a very big difference from my choice of followers. It's just the same messages come out within the different populations that we all talked about in very different ways. And I think that that's very important. You don't have to have access to what society deems as the most prestigious. You don't have to have access to it to still get the same messages. People who don't, I've heard from prisoners who have the same messages as these politicians. And why do we give more respect to someone in a suit and tie than someone who's been abused by systematic, you know, oppressions, you know? So I've learned that it doesn't matter where the message comes from, it can still be just as powerful.
Yeah, that's so true. Yeah, just thinking about like the ways in which I've even seen people on Twitter be like, there's a difference in how people interact with me when I have PhD after my name or doctor before my name, or just like thinking about the ways in which social media, I think Korie is here. Just like the ways in which social media allows, I don't know if it's gonna let me let him in. Let's see. But just like the ways in which, there we go. Like social media makes it possible for us to all talk to each other, right? To give Korie a chance to get logged in. So, okay, so this gives me a chance to ask this kind of more focused question for B while Korie settles in, of like, just thinking about protest and activism. So given kind of like your research area and just interest in things, B, I was wondering if like you could maybe think or talk a little bit about just like the extent to which social media organizing, however you want to kind of think about organizing in this case, like can it be co-opted by folks outside of a group or community on social media, right? And I wonder if you can maybe speak to like what that looks like, because that seems to be one of the tensions that's very prominent in this moment of like who should be in this conversation or sort of who should not be there at all. And I'm thinking about this especially because like I keep hearing people describe 2020's like protests and teach-ins and like actions as being like having a different energy. And I feel that I hear that, you know, for each point in which we have these moments happen, but I definitely am hearing that more and more. And I'm wondering if like what your thoughts are about sort of this current moment and like how it's being framed in terms of being like new or different or like watershed moment, I think is what we're hearing from mainstream media.
Yeah, I definitely think that social media organizing can be co-opted. And I guess I keep thinking about the academy and the ways in which they're talking or not talking about things that are going on. And I think that they'll take whatever language is being shared on social media and they'll take those little bits and kind of plug them into conversations. But they're not actually trying to do the real work. So they're just kind of being performative and presenting like they're having these conversations that are needed. But they're not really doing, you know, following through with the kinds of things that they say they will. So I guess I'm thinking a lot about everything that happened with the protests and the ways in which actually that was brought attention to my program. And then they had these conversations where, I don't know, like some kind of like diversity and equity conversation, but they weren't really holding themselves accountable to the ways in which they don't support BIPOC in our department. And I guess in general, most of my answers are just going to be me talking shit about my department, which is fine. But
love it. I love
that. Just being honest. But I guess that's because that's my reality here. I'm always thinking about the ways in which they're co-opting the things that we bring up to them. We being like the few of us who are bringing our concerns and how are they supporting our livelihood. And so I definitely rely on social media community because these things are not happening outside of the small groups I'm a part of. So it's really frustrating when I'm seeing these things co-opted by the academy, because they're just holding like this space that it doesn't mean anything. They're just doing it because we're telling them that they have to have this space. So that's been really, really frustrating to see that going on. But in terms of my research engaging with these things, I'm definitely thinking of how I want to situate, especially things that have happened in the pandemic, and actually joked with one of my mentors about like, I can't wait to see all these papers coming up after the pandemic of like racism during the pandemic, and or just like, contextualizing everything in the pandemic. Definitely valid things that are happening, but it's just funny the ways I think that certain just scholars will, try to take advantage of these kinds of things. I'm like, ooh, perfect time to talk about some trauma. Like, and it's just the privilege of writing about these things versus I'm experiencing this shit every single day, right? It's not just something I'm going to pin for later and write about. Yeah, so in terms of my research, I'm starting to just think more about my dissertation and thinking about specifically trans trauma and just thinking about healing a lot. So I'm definitely going to take some of the conversations that I had during the pandemic and all the lack of support that's been present and bring that into my own framework, because I think it's important to do so, but still kind of thinking about how exactly I want to frame this. But it's constantly changing for sure, especially with the pandemic.
Before we move to the next question, Korie, one, it's nice to see you. I'm so happy you're here. And two, can you kind of introduce yourself to the people who will watch this after the fact?
Hi, my name is Korie Houston. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I work at UC San Diego's LGBT Resource Center, and I overslept today because my on my phone. So
totally okay.
Professionalism, what's that?
Well,
in a pandemic, who knows?
I love that we can celebrate in this moment that like the people are being introduced to Korie's dramatic entrances, even in the pandemic. I love this continuous energy. This is beautiful.
My cat was laying on my phone and I hit the snooze button because when I set my alarm at 8 and I heard nothing, and then I woke up and I saw it was on snooze, I was like, how is that possible? So please forgive me, all of you.
I think this is something that we will definitely return to when we get to virtual workspace in this, because that feels very relevant and very real. Because as I told everybody, Timey's in the bathroom, Ferris is in her crate, and that's the only reason we're not getting cat dialogue in the middle of this. But kind of question for everybody, excuse me, to transition from B's like beautiful, brilliant answer. And also just like to pause and say, I just really enjoy listening to you all. And I feel like I learn so much from you each time that you speak. So if I'm making faces, I promise it's because I'm just like, wow, I know that I'm a bobblehead because I'm just like, I agree with everything you're saying. And it just, Zoom makes me so much more aware of how much I do this. But I think y'all are geniuses. And I wanted to kind of move from sort of that concentrated question for B to the larger question of like, what have been y'all's thoughts about the photos we're getting right now during these protests? Because we're getting a good number of them. And I feel like this maybe kind of relates back to what Christian was saying earlier about thinking about colleagues. But I just really wonder what y'all's thoughts are about like when you see photos in this moment, whether it's people you know or people that you follow or people you don't know, and it's like a photo of them in the street or a photo with a poster that sometimes almost feels like Pinterest board worthy. Like, I really wonder what y'all's feelings are. And if you feel like those photos for you, like, do they allow for or change kind of like dialogue around these issues to continue? Or do they feel like kind of that performative allyship stuff that Christian was talking about earlier? So what do you all think? Photos happening right now.
I think it depends. Well, for me, it depends on the source of the photos. Like, depending on what account they came from. Like, okay, so if it's personal for me and I'm seeing a person, are you post it? First of all, did you only post that you were at a protest and then there was nothing else? at all. So did I get this photo op? Because as a person who's been to a protest, I've seen people who go take protest pictures and then leave, and they're not there to be in the protest. They just, I want to take pictures. I want these signs. I want to put them up. Basically, like, let me get this whole Instagram aesthetic that I'm being activist. And then they trickle off when like the marches happen or the police are coming and they start macing, and it's like they're ghosts. So when I look at that, and I always ask questions like, so were you there? Or if I'm just seeing posters and you're not in the picture, and I'll be that person in the comments like, so where were you? Did you take this picture? Were you there? Were you protesting and someone else took this picture? Because I like to call stuff out. So to me, it just depends on the source. And then also when we're talking about like protest pictures that they show in the news, and we know how news stations are biased. So some of them will show like the more aggressive ones to make it look like people are animals and savagery. And then you'll see the ones where they're having peaceful protests and everyone is out and they're marching. And then they show like when they're being provoked by the police. So I always try to consider the source of the picture and then try to make like different judgments from, well, not so much judgments, but ask questions from there. And I think that's important. But when it like, if it comes to people that I know, or if they don't say anything at all, but then they like my protest picture, I'm just like, that is another connotation. That if you'll like everything I'm retweeting, but you've been silent, I think that says a lot about you as well as me too.
They're not usually there for the cause, right? Like, and I think we saw that with the Women's March, right? Where you saw a lot of people with their like pink pussy hats and walking around with their photo ops. I think it's beyond performative, especially when you're scrolling through social media and you see people who aren't down for the cause, like going to these protests, and you see them like in front of these crowds, like, and the crowds are obviously doing something, and they got that perfect Instagrammable moment, and you look at that and you're like, huh, like, I didn't know you were into that, right? I didn't know you were out here trying to fight for Black lives, but you look through their feed and there's no posts about Black lives. It's posts about, I don't know, like, buy this from HelloFresh because I'm an influencer. Like, no. It's deeply problematic because when you're, it's like, it's creating an aesthetic, I guess, that's non-existent. Letting people in on this world that you're woke when you're really not. And it's woke porn. That's what it is.
Yeah, to be a part of a movement, just to be able to show like, look, I was there, rather than look, I did something, or I said something. I definitely agree with you, Korie, on that one. I've seen a lot of people that I know, and it's not necessarily performative, but in a way it might be, but they go out there, they have their Black Lives Matter on shirts, and they have their fists up, and it's just, I don't like to discredit people for not being vocal outside of this moment. A lot of people, I've seen a lot of posts saying, well, why is everyone just protesting now? Everyone's an activist all of a sudden. We're in a pandemic and a lot of people are dealing with unemployment. A lot of people don't have childcare to get out of the house. So unfortunately, this is the perfect time for a protest. There's a reason there's been thousands and thousands and thousands every day since George Floyd's murder. So I don't think that it's fair to say, like, I just think it's performative. You all are just out here just because. No, people are out here because either I'm going to sit at home and not do anything to fight this injustice, or I'm just going to go outside and be a part of it. So there are those good people who, haven't done it in the past because they might not have had the circumstances to. They might have been at a 9-to-5 job, have kids, have no resources to get to a protest. I can't miss a day of work just to go fight for injustice. I can't do that. But right now is the time that we see our country coming together on this issue, or separating themselves and completely quarantining themselves away from racism. Like, they're doing a horrible job at doing it against COVID, but when it comes to racism, oh no, let me put my mask on. They'll be like, it's very interesting to see how people are selective in what they are willing to fight for. But the performative stuff is definitely there. Not going to take away from that. But I don't like to blame people who have never spoken out against it or shown up at any of these protests for any of the unfortunate innocent lives that have died before. I don't want to put that on like, oh, so you're just out here now for what? No, I'm glad you're out here. I'm glad you're able to be here. I'm glad you're doing something. I hope you're doing more than just taking a picture and going home. And a lot of people have stayed through a lot of it, but I definitely, it's more so, I'm gonna say it, it's more so the whites who are going out and doing performative stuff. Black people don't have the access to just perform racism, to access, I can't perform this, my skin color. Mexican people don't have the access to perform whether or not they have their papers to be at a protest. You know, they're starting to bring ICE out, you know, are you even allowed to be out? They have their certain sectors of enforcement for certain people, you know. The cops will deal with the blacks, ICE will deal with the Mexicans, everyone else will just fall in line wherever they fall. So it depends on how people are like trying to perform their activism, you know, staying away from the violence, staying away from, you know, the real gritty stuff of it, and just putting that cute aesthetic out on Instagram, putting a black and white filter over it. So cute. I think that these pictures have the power to be what the pictures in the civil rights movement were. They come off so emotional. Like when I saw Minneapolis and like the police department on fire and people standing over it, you know, the real rioters and protesters who felt the emotion of this murder so heavily when they're in their moment. Those are the photos that make me cry. You know, those are the photos that I want to see my child looking at in a museum one day. I want the fight to be seen like that. So I don't want these influencers and these cute little people and like, I don't want that to infiltrate the actual movement with these photos, because these photos are so historical. They feel like the Great Depression. They feel like everything in this moment. You just see the vulnerability of people, the anger, the fear, you know, and just still fighting against the injustice. These photos have a way to be powerful, and yet I think people are taking away from it because of the cuteness of being kind of insta famous right now.
I think something to fully acknowledge for all of that is just when people take those photos to not center themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's not about you. It's really not about you. Don't blur everything out in the background. You know? It's not about you in that moment.
iPhone portrait mode.
You can definitely see the difference in people's, the way they portray their activism. If it is just them, it shows what their meaning is behind it, you know?
Yeah. So thinking then about, to kind of transition to our second subsection, I suppose, of like just multicultural and anti-racist children's literature. And I wanted to include this in part because we got a specialist with Christian, we got a mom with Quincy, right? All of us have been children or teenagers before, but also I think that there's a real way, and Christian's so much more qualified to talk about this than me, which is why I'm excited she's here. I think there's a real way in which children get overlooked and literature for children gets overlooked or discredited as being simple or not important or irrelevant. And I think that much like we're seeing conversations shift to recognizing that when we're talking about incarceration in the prison industrial complex, we need to be in dialogue with incarcerated or formerly incarcerated folks. I think a similar thing is true of thinking about children's literature and child readers, especially in this moment that we continuously see a push for, and I know I say this all the time to people too, of like, y'all need to read more, right? And so I wanted to kind of have this focused question for Christian of just kind of giving us a little bit more insight on your work with middle and high school youth, but then also your research on multicultural literature, because I'm curious, with your focus being on literature for children and young adults, like what are some of the books or topics that you're finding that you're being like drawn towards, whether in this moment or more in like generally, and just also like why multicultural literature? Because I feel like that's something we're seeing get a moment as well. And sometimes I wonder if people know sort of why they're pointing to that as a resource or this as a moment.
Okay. So to start for the why multicultural literature, literature for me has always been not only an escapism, but also a way to be seen. And I think Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop, who they call like the mother of multicultural literature, she says it best. She's like, literature is like mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. It's how people get to see inside of other cultures, other race, other genders. They get to be able to be in this place where they can experience something different than their very own reality. So when I'm thinking about literature, for me and literature for kids, I like to look at contemporary stories, and more so contemporary stories with like a social justice aspect. So some of the stories that I'm drawn to because of the demographic of students that I've interacted with as a high school teacher has been like, of course, Black youth, South Asian students, and then LGBTQ students. So a lot of the literature that I do first is for Black girls to kind of combat adultification and how Black girls are never seen as like innocent. They're never protected. They're always seen like overly sexual, overly aggressive. They're pushed out of the classroom. So working in minority schools and bringing literature for my students that they can see themselves like experiencing Black joy and living everyday lives, and all of their stories don't have to be police brutality. It doesn't have to be trauma stories. And those stories are important too. Those stories are just highlighted all of the time. And stories where regular kids, Black kids, brown kids, LGBTQ kids, where they're just kids living their lives, finding their identities, those stories aren't always amplified. So I try to find those stories so that my students can see that they're represented and have a voice, and kind of encourage them in their reading to write about their stories, to bring their stories out so that they can liberate other people. Also, going off of using multicultural literature, I also like to do visual literature too. So I've gotten into doing like comics and graphic novels and bringing those in, because there also aren't a lot of Black and brown characters that are amplified for our students, and them being able to see themselves visually as well, I think is important. And having a lot of Black comics, but also showing who's behind the stories and telling them about like Black and brown writers and Black and brown illustrators and artists, so they can see beyond what's put in front of them, because they get this colonized curriculum that basically gives them a whitewashed version of their history and then nothing else. And then they're never seen or they're never heard from again. I remember, even for me, I think the first time I read a Black character, I was maybe in 11th grade. I went through elementary, middle school, high school, and then I finally got a book that was written by a Black person that had Black characters just living their lives. And they weren't like adult books. Like I was reading Waiting to Exhale when I shouldn't have been, but then went back. It was adult for my age. But then I remember getting a book. I remember that book. It was Omar Tyree's Fly Girl. And it was about Tracy Ellis, and it was Tracy Ellis living her life like as a teenage Black girl, and just how she grew up in identity. And I never seen that. I had to read The Babysitter's Club and Harriet the Spy and Ramona. And if they had any Black people, they were way in the back. They were the side character. They're the secondary characters. We never had stories, or when we had stories, they were slave narratives. And that's all that we got. And it's like, oh yeah, we were in slavery, and then, Abraham freed you all, and, yay, civil rights, and then you had MLK. So, and then nothing else. And I don't want my students to ever have to go through that, where they don't feel like they're seen in the books that they're reading, or if they're seen, they're only seen through like the white gaze and a mono lens, and they're not seen for all the different facets and aspects and layers that they really are.
Yeah, I'm wondering, Quincy, for you as a mom, like to a 5-year-old, like what has your process been thinking about all these things that Christian has just presented, of just thinking about like the real absence, right? Or like kind of this back and forth between absence, but then very limited representation. I wonder what your process has been as a mom, trying to find books for Maya, and just like what characters or stories are you looking for her, but then also her as a child reader, like what do you see her being drawn to as well? Because I wonder if her like what she's looking for is different or similar to sort of what you're hoping that she'll pick up or what you're hoping to find.
Right. So, good Lord. Being a mom, being a Black mom of a Black daughter or son, I'll say it for both, it's difficult finding stories that represent your child. I will say that flat out. It was, when you have your baby, when you're pregnant, people like to buy you Dr. Seuss, like to buy you picture books, and all that's fine to a certain extent, because nobody goes out of their way to look for Black authors for a Black mother, for a Black child. There's plenty of Black stories out there for children, but nobody goes out of their way to look for it. Nobody feels like it's important to see. I remember as a kid, kind of like Christian, I don't even remember the first time I read a Black story written by a Black person where it's not related to slavery or, you know, the war on drugs, gang violence, anything around those limitations for Black people. So I don't remember just being a little Black girl riding a bike with her dad or mom and falling down and getting up and learning how to ride a bike and be happy. I never learned those stories. They always were presented to me in white bodies for some reason. And even when I had Maya and I was looking through some of her books and I was reading some of her books and I started to become offended by a lot of her books, all of the regular people were white people. All of the criminals were brown or Black people. And I did not like that. I didn't like how they portrayed cops in these books, even though it's very innocent. It redistributes the image that they want these Black children to see. White kids don't have to look through these books and see themselves being arrested. Like, what did they do? No, it's just a good cop doing their job, right? And it's usually a white cop, white male typically. So I had Maya pick out her books. I just left. That's whenever I'm leaving the video, it's because I'm dealing with something with my child. I'm so sorry. But I told her to pick out her Black books yesterday and she put them somewhere. So I went and go grab them. And it's literally only three. It's 3 books out of her little library. And credit to Katie, she gave me 2 of them. But they finally have images of my daughter, you know, they have like Black girls on every page, happy, you know, just being who they are. And oh my God, speaking of Black girls, oh my God, I was just waiting for her to show up. You got perfect timing, kid.
She's like, oh, I think you're talking about me. I'll make my appearance.
Right. No, you can't hear. It's okay. But this is Maya. This is my daughter. Okay, fine. There's really no saying no to her at the moment.
Hi, Mama.
Hi, Katie.
So for me, at a very young age, around 2 years old, I just stopped buying books that only portrayed white kids. I didn't like the fact that she couldn't.
Have a piece of this gum.
As long as you stop talking, Penny, thank you. You're supposed to be downstairs with your grandpa. Yeah.
This is real. This is what actual conversations look like, I feel like.
So once I noticed that I did not like how she was being represented, she couldn't see herself. I just stopped. Give me my AirPod back. You're not taking it up. Give it to me. Bye. Get out of my room. I really stopped focusing on buying Dr. Seuss. I really stopped focusing on buying these white characters for my kid. I asked specifically for books for her birthday or for Christmas. I want Black stories because I need her to not go through what I went through as a child. I need her to see herself as beautiful, as worthy, as necessary in people's stories, because I never felt that. I never, ever, ever had a Black children's book for myself. And I think that that's very sad, but I think this is the generation that we're able to change that. I don't think Black kids should be the only kids reading Black stories. You know, white kids are limited by whoever is raising them, wherever they're going to school, by society. You don't ever see Black stories. You don't ever see brown stories. You don't ever see queer stories. You see white, Christian, heterosexual stories, man and woman raising children, having a job, blah, blah, blah. And so for me, it's been more than a challenge finding stuff for her. You know, it's hard, but it's out there and it's accessible. You have to find the Black authors. You have to pay more money, and I'm fine with that because I know it's going towards a better cause than paying less money for just the standard. And I think that's going to cause the change in our society is we have to be willing to, unfortunately, I don't think it's unfortunate. We have to be willing to pay more for our kids to feel more secure in their own skin, in their own bodies, in their own personalhood. It is cheaper to continue what society has put out there. It's cheaper. You can get 10 Dr. Seuss books for $5, and Dr. Seuss was the biggest racist I've ever read about. So it's just, there are those issues. And I think that for her, having people, you know, Katie, me, other friends that have been, you know, exposed to these types of authors and academia and stuff, it gives me the opportunity to at least show her that there are other options out there other than these white stories. And she feels better about it. She feels pretty. She loves her hair. She loves her skin. She doesn't see anything wrong with being Black. And I think that's a big difference than what I grew up with.
Yeah, I wonder, B, if you can maybe jump in here, and then Korie, of like thinking about like this representation in pop culture that Christian and Quincy have just spoken to. I wonder if like in your case and other folks, just like an instance, like do you have an instance that comes to mind if we're thinking about Christian and Quincy being like, I didn't have that till like 11th grade or much later or at all? Like, can you think of a time when like you were engaging with a mediated narrative and it was sort of like that, oh my gosh, I'm actually represented kind of moment? And like, if you did have that moment, whatever that looks like what about it was meaningful for you? And if you didn't, like, what could have been really impactful? Because I think Christian really spoke beautifully to that feeling of like, I'm teaching to really prevent this from being replicated, right? And I think that Quincy's getting to a similar thing here too, of like, I've gone through this, and now by curating this like specific library for Maya, she won't face this. So I wonder, B, what your experience was with mediated narratives. And then Korie, I would love to hear about your experience on that, but then also just with your role at the UCSD LGBT Resource Center. Like, do y'all use mediated narratives, whether it's children's lit or just like pop culture or social media more broadly, to kind of talk about these topics related to, you know, justice, representation, and identity? So B, and then Korie, what comes to mind?
It's wild. I'm like, I was trying so hard to think of an example. I'm like, what did I read? And I remember this book that I read when I think I was in middle school, and it's called Esperanza Rising, or Rising Esperanza. Yeah, so that was the one book, and I was like, why do I like this book so much? And I obviously still remember it, right? And that was the one book, right? And I think her story was about like, I think it was about farm workers or something, and her family like immigrating. And I'm like, right, what story haven't I read of like Latinx folks that is about this? But
yeah,
I just remember really resonating with that story, and just, I don't even remember much more of the details, but I remember I loved that book. And then and in terms of like, I was trying to think about films, and I'm like, at what point? And I remember watching Selena, right? Like the movie, and I'm like, an emotional mess. And just like really connecting with the characters, and I'm just looking at my family like, oh, there's my whoever is being represented. And it just made me think of novelas that I watched growing up with my grandma. So those are, I think, the moments where I felt most connected, or I feel like were accurate representations, but obviously very cultural examples, right? The specific audience's view, right? So I feel like those are the times where I felt most represented. But in terms of books, not many, just like that one book that I can think of that was like specifically, I felt like, yes, like I can connect to this character. Yeah, which is really, really sad, because I remember having a conversation about like all my favorite rom-coms, and just thinking about movies like The Notebook and Titanic and all these just white ass movies. I'm like, damn, right? I want to see this story about love that has BIPOC characters in it, because that's possible, right? And it's a trip how much these like lack of examples that I didn't have growing up definitely impacted to just images of like, to my own self-worth and also body image issues, and just like, damn, is there going to be an example of a story that I can connect to where those folks are being loved? And it's a trip to try to find those examples. Even now, that Hollywood is trash. So even now, I'm like, I'm grateful for examples like Pose that I can think of, or the Netflix documentary Disclosure. Still limited in some ways, still showing, but yeah, growing up there wasn't a lot for sure. Yeah.
That is a hard question. Hard question. Even reading the question in advance, I still can't think of a book. I'm really like digging deep here, digging back to elementary school and like middle school, and like I cannot recall a single book that I read. Like maybe Christian or Quincy might be able to help me out here with a book. I don't know.
If it was early English, I think when I read a Black character, it was To Kill a Mockingbird.
Oh, I don't want to.
Yeah.
No,
we're not talking about To Kill or Huckleberry Finn.
Yes.
We're not talking about those. But the question for Korie for LGBTQ, or if there's like, wow, that's really like.
Yeah, this is partially why I gave you the hard question. Professional experience, but also just like
for my own Black identity, I got nothing. If we're gonna talk about television, I could say there is a TV show called Static Shock that
I was gonna say Jackson.
Love that. Yes.
I can name so many television shows, but I cannot name a book. And
no, there was no book about Black males, Black children, Black LGBTQ, Black families. There was nothing about Black anything outside of slavery. Literally.
I read John Henry, but that was kind of about slavery. So I mean,
Little Bill.
And he died at the end. So spoiler alert. Sorry, it's been out for a long time though. So not sorry. But for my work at UC San Diego, for as far as mediated narratives go, so our center has a library in it with tons of different media that we utilize. It's been curated over about 2 decades now, because we just celebrated 20 years on campus. And as we continue like our time on campus, we remove a lot of literature because sometimes it's harmful to like keep outdated like language and like outdated stories. But I think the biggest challenge is a lot of the stories really focus on cis gay white men. Like a lot of stories.
All of them.
Whether it's fictional, whether it's nonfiction, it's always just like Chad and his lover Brad, and I'm just like, I don't got time for this.
There was one high school book.
Are you talking about Simon? The Love Simon book?
It had to go with The Great Gatsby. It's like the I don't know, it's about this little white boy that went to like a military school, and he like got to deal with going through doing sexual stuff with one of his roommates, but he was claimed to be sure. What is it?
You're not talking about The Chocolate War, are you?
Catcher in the Rye.
I want to know
Okay.
This is one of those moments that people are probably
that was probably the only LGBTQ kind of ish, because they did have something with the boys at the school, right? That was probably the only thing in youthhood that I can remember that's LGBTQ-ish. They skated over it because he went back home to have a girlfriend.
Holden Caulfield is one of the worst characters in literature. And I stand by that statement. And if anyone ever tries to drag me for that after seeing this, they can fight me.
It was the worst. It was cringy reading it in class, and it was just like, oh, this isn't right. This is the first time I'm hearing about, teenagers being able to understand their sexuality, and this is the representation I get, and it's white boys.
Yeah,
talk about disappointment.
This might be a good moment for maybe B also to jump in because that sigh said like 1,000 words with it, I feel like.
It was disappointment because it could have been so much more. I mean, they didn't even have to put that in that story. Catcher in the Rye was boring. Let me tell you, the only good part about Catcher in the Rye was the LGBTQ stuff. Come on. Yep. Come on. I don't care about your private issues at your super 16-acre house with your family. Oh my God. No, it was the good stuff in that little room that nobody knew about.
B, what are your reactions to
when aren't, cutie pug stories thrown in just to spice up other bland ass stories? That's the question. Because I feel like they're always, presented in ways to be fetishized or to be presented as this kind of fantasy, but then they will always return to their super heteronormative life. So it's I'm like what examples did I have growing up of LGBTQ?
Nothing.
Literature,
and that's film, and B, you brought
I
up
queer them up in my mind. I always made them queer characters in my mind, but
you brought up Pose, and that's like a really big difference from our generation to the newest generation. They get visual euphoria. They get visualization.
Love
right
it.
now.
Yes.
There's beautiful show.
There's more than just one, and there's more than just one color, one shape, one size, one gender. So I think we are in a very good moment of change because we can't even claim anything, but the kids these days get to claim stuff for themselves.
So with my work in the center, we try to shy away a lot from like harmful narratives that have been perpetuated because they don't serve us. We use them for educational purposes, like we acknowledge the problematic elements of things, while also highlighting and praising the things they did right, and also highlighting and praising the things people are still doing right. And so I generally don't think we use a lot of books as much as we could in our space, but we definitely use a lot of articles. We use a lot of social media pages. I know earlier, before I was here, y'all talked a little about activists that you would like follow on social media. And so we definitely use a lot of for conversations about allyship. We use a lot of the voices of folks who do the work because sometimes our story is not always a resource, right? Like a good point of our center is something that we do is with social justice representation and identity. I may be Black and I may be queer, but like my story is not like the resource that I'm here to provide for you. And so you have all these books, all of these articles that you could read. You could look it up instead of asking a queer person or a Black person, like, what happened to you in your childhood that made you this way? Like, I'm not here for that, And so I think that's something a lot of our students struggle with is trying to kind of balance that line. And the last thing I'll mention is bringing people in who want to share their stories. You mentioned Pose. We brought MJ Rodriguez to my campus and she got to, I have photos with her. She's so fun. Oh my God. But she shared her experiences with us and she talked about representation. She talked about how she just humanized herself for people because what's the point of looking at someone and saying like, I don't like your community when everything about them screams like, I'm a relatable person. Like, I don't know, working for LGBTQI plus spaces can be a lot. Everyone has this expectation that your story is the only thing worth telling, but it's not just about your story. It's also about advocacy. It's also about uplifting the voices of our most marginalized. It's not just about being cis. It's not just about being gay. It's about respecting and acknowledging that our community is big and vast. The work doesn't just come from old literature from cis gay white men, from Brad and his lover Chad.
Okay, like because I know we can go for 5 hours, so I'm gonna keep us.
I know we could
go to Pose, because I know Quincy feels a type way. I also just like love that like B is just like, oh yeah, I interviewed Alok for a podcast, and Corey's like, oh, I just MJ to campus, like just like this casual, like amazing,
nonchalant.
I love it. I'm sorry.
No, it's amazing.
It's amazing.
And I think that what Korie said so poignantly of our story is not a resource to just sort of be instrumentalized, or even like, I wish Keidra was here, shout out to Keidra Taylor, like something that she's been thinking about too is like, as she puts it, like Black people are having a moment, but then that moment gets replaced with another moment for someone else, and then it gets replaced with another moment, and so suddenly it's almost like you're having to run at a certain pace you weren't prepared for, and because you're worried about that spotlight being moved elsewhere, right? And so that brings me to this next question of like solidarity, anti-racism, and allyship, right? And I bring this because I wanted to ask you all, and maybe starting with Christian, like, I know I was circulating these, I know other people were circulating these, but social media really became a space where reading lists were becoming very popular. And especially on Twitter, we were seeing a lot of folks be like, actually read the reading list that you're sharing, right? Don't just share it and think of it as sort of an external facing resource. Like people need to be reading the things that they're circulating, and also just thinking about what they're sharing. And so I wanted to, in as much of a soundbite as possible, and I know it's hard because we got one last section after this, of like, what has been sort of y'all's reactions to the reading lists and the resources and the solidarity statements that we're seeing? And maybe be thinking about rhetoric with those solidarity statements. I feel like those are sort of the three major categories or containers that really have become really visible. And I just wonder, and skepticism is welcome here as well as hopefulness, but I wonder, like, are there instances where you felt like social media posts such as these, like I include some here, of like people promoting books that are coming out, or people circulating these reading lists, or like celebrities like Ariana Grande who sort of embed posts about Black Lives Matter within their like Instagram grid, as opposed to just having it in their like stories that go away after a certain point. I wonder what y'all's thoughts are about, like, do these social media posts help clarify concepts and distribute information in ways that you feel like is really important? Or have you had moments where you're sort of like, I'm seeing terms be appropriated or hashtags be appropriated, and like possibly harm being enacted through these platforms? So maybe let's go to Christian, and then B, and then Korie, and then Quincy.
You said a lot of what I would have said anyway. I think for me is both skepticism and being hopeful, because I never want to be negative. I think they are great resources. People don't always know these things are available. They may not have had access. So I think they need to know, but at the same time, like, I wanted to maintain its longevity. I want it to be more than a moment, for it to be longstanding, for it to continuously be impactful, because like you said, from mediated narratives to social media, we've had moments where boom, we're inundated with all of these things, and then you don't see it anymore, and it's gone, and then it cycles back, and it happens again. And I think even Ibram Kendi, he said this in his How to Be an Anti-Racist. He was like, racial progression is always a dual force with racism progression. So when we have progress moving forward in race, we also have progress moving forward in racism, and it's always that duality. So I want to be more hopeful that having these resources available, having these people, having these conversations and this dialogue will work towards something long-standing, something impactful, and something that we won't always have to have this stop and start. So I'm hoping, I'm holding on to that this will have some long-standing impact. And in a decade from now, our kids and our scholars won't be having this same conversation that we are having, or our partners and things of that. Anybody who we're involved with won't be having these same conversations of, in 2020, they were talking about this, and we're in 2030 and we're still having the same conversation.
Yeah. B, what do you think?
Yeah, I really appreciate what you said. And I think you brought up this notion of just the temporariness of social media, because it would be great if these things stay, right? I'm looking at Ariana Grande's grid, and I'm like, okay, I'm more skeptical of celebrities usually in general, but I wonder how long that will last, and if that will, I'm most likely actually assuming that will probably change up to whatever is going on at the moment. Because that's part of what social media is like, people are centering their posts around what's going on. And I'm, in terms of like the reading list and things like that, like I'm grateful for the resources, definitely, because a lot of folks actually don't know where to start. There are some great folks who are posting things of like, here are some places to start just to even do the research. Here are some things you can Google. Here are some good books or whatever. I personally hate just when folks say like, go read, just go do, because I feel like that's inaccessible, and just saying that, because even having access to this terminology and things like that, I think is a whole level of privilege. So I definitely feel some way. I don't like reading lists. I try to be careful with in terms of how I share it, or like what audience it is that I'm sharing them to. Because definitely agree, it's important to read and do that work. But how is that, like, who does that actually apply to? I'm constantly thinking about that. Because I want to create reading lists, right, where it's like I can share to all kind of audiences, ages. Thinking of like my grandmother, can she read this? Can I translate this in a way that she can understand? So I definitely am thinking and sitting with what's going to happen moving forward. I want to be more hopeful and think that it's not just going to fade away, along with just, again, going to that notion of temporariness. But I am hopeful and grateful for folks who keep that on their social, and that's what their whole social media platform is about, is continuing to advocate for themselves and for their communities. So, yeah.
A huge question I have is what happens when Black lives aren't trending? What happens when a social issue is not trending anymore? And when people go back, this can go back to the conversation about photo ops, this can go back to everything. But I'm hopeful. For the reading lists are wonderful. I think it's accessibility is a huge criticism I have and many others have of social justice spaces. Inaccessible language, inaccessible terminology, inaccessible just everything, and giving people a place to start, because a lot of people don't know where to start. And I think that's something we kind of forget doing social justice work, that people still always need a 101, and it's important whether we find value in it or not. As far as celebrities go, I mean, Katie, I love Ariana Grande, so I'm not gonna be quiet about that. But I criticize her, right, for she benefits a lot from Black and brown cultures, being a white woman, and I think I'm glad that she's speaking up, though. I'm glad it's on her grid. I'm glad it's not just on a story disappearing. I'm glad that people can go to her page whenever they want and see Black Lives Matter, do something about it. She's unfollowed people who are not speaking up, to call out other celebrities who are not speaking up. I think that's really important. And there's a lot of celebrities out there doing the work, but it's just a matter of, is this for your brand, or is this for the movement? And so that's something important to critique, something to think about, something to talk about. And since we don't have access to celebrities, gotta expect other celebrities to hold them accountable. And so it's kind of a weird cycle.
That's a great point. Yeah. Quincy, what do you think?
Yeah, I'll definitely agree with Korie on that point, where it's I feel like celebrity voices aren't necessarily needed in these fights. We have voices from people on the streets who are dealing with it firsthand, who need to be heard. I feel like a celebrity's position in this, I really liked when I first saw when all these George Floyd protests started happening, celebrities were bailing people out, no questions asked, getting lawyers, no questions asked. You all have the power, celebrities speaking, people in power, they have the power to finance it, and they have the power to speak to the higher ups about it. They don't need to speak to the public about it, because we are speaking with our actions, with our protests, with these posts. We are doing it. Our voices are being loud as they can be. I feel like their activism needs to be with what they have accessible to them. They have money. They have, they can, Kim Kardashian, she's very problematic, but she has the ability to get into the room with Donald Trump at any moment that she wants. That's a big deal. That's huge. A lot of these celebrities do. If they call him up, they call up the White House, they can get into the White House and make our voices heard. We don't need your opinion in that moment. If you can just give us the accessibility to them, to these lawmakers, these congressmen, these politicians, all of them, the people who are going to actually be the ones, unfortunately, at the hands of making change for us, even though it's really the people on the bottom forcing them to do it. All we need the rich and the powerful and the famous to do is get our voices into the room. We need access. They have the access. They have the money. We don't need them. I mean, I'm a big fan of Ariana Grande too, but it's like, is it gonna stay forever? You know, as soon as your next album drops, as soon as it's the next tour, are those Black Lives Matter posts gonna be just as fluent as, you know, your promotions? The reading lists, I think, are amazing. I do have the same arguments that you should be reading your reading list before you just present them to the public. You don't know what you're necessarily putting out there, and the very last chapter could be completely against what you're talking about. So to have some type of understanding about what you're putting out there to the public and saying, like, this is what you should be reading, you should know what you're talking about. Why should I be reading this? What influence is it going to have on me? What impact could it have on this issue? So, yeah, I definitely think that it's just a social disconnect. You know, people on the ground are doing a lot of the activism, a lot of the work, a lot of the reading, a lot of the knowledge. Are these celebrities reading these books? Have they read the new Jim Crow? Do they know what's going on? You know, you can post a little fist up and put that little BLM hashtag. Are you doing anything to understand what it's actually about? Are you doing anything to promote it, to further it, to help the people who are on the ground doing it? If we were to get everybody who has just been arrested for absolutely no reason out to continue the fight, I think that's enough for celebrities at this point, because I feel like their memos are very artificial. Oh, we stand with Black lives. We don't need you to stand with us, bro. We need you to do something for us. We're standing on our own. Can you do something? And that's a big deal.
Yeah, and I think that actually, so this brings us to our final section of just like thinking about the technologies that make this possible. And I love what Quincy just said about thinking about, so like, who has the access and the generational access to things like Capitol, right? Like, who has the ability to perhaps advocate, or in the case of people like Ariana Grande and Kim Kardashian, who are, or who position themselves as racially flexible in that they can sort of change their skin tone, right? And also sort of posture themselves differently depending on when they want to emphasize or sort of falsify a proximity to Blackness, depending on sort of what's convenient to them, right? This like leads me to then ask these questions about sort of how we as people who are trying to do this work in very different ways, right? Both in terms of like talking to the people that we know, interacting with people on social media, but then also thinking about big picture stuff. I'm wondering about sort of three final things. The first of which being sort of the virtual workspace. And this gets back to what Korie was saying about his cat sitting on his phone. Like, a lot of us right now have, I think, become more reliant on our devices, whatever those look like, right? Because we are, as you all spoke to, in a pandemic. So all of a sudden, sort of these issues that have all been in play, issues like health insurance and like health care, and just who is deemed worthy of care. This is something I think that a lot of disabled folks and disabled activists especially have been pointing out, and trans activists as well, right? Of like, who gets care, who gets time, who gets attention. And as B's pointing to, that there appears to be a space that's sort of open on celebrity channels, and it just gets filled with whatever is sort of most pressing at this moment. And I wonder about, in your own lives in this current moment, when we have traffic noise and kiddos and cats and families and all these things, partners, right? How has this shift to Zoom and video calling changed or impacted the work that you're doing, or how you're processing these things? And I ask this in part because I wonder, like, for BIPOC and QTPOC already, there's an existing sort of expectation that there should be more work coming from us, right? And additionally, in some ways, I think also an expectation of, you're going to do this work because it affects you or your community. Whereas when white folks do this work, it's sort of like, oh, they elect to do it, therefore they're up for awards and are like presented as being sort of, you know, special and singular for doing the absolute least. So I wonder if for y'all, like, are there ways in which you have found that colleagues or just, I don't know, other forces have sort of expected you to be more available to work or to movement work or whatever in this moment, now that you're working from home, and have those moments when you're like potentially feeling that pressure to be more available? Does that engage with or interface with the existing things of like racism, sexism, and ableism? And with all of that being said, right, in my usual word sandwich word cloud, like, how are you setting boundaries? Can you set boundaries? And like, do you find that social exhaustion and just emotional labor are like different for you now that you're sort of at home and there's perhaps an expectation of like, well, you can just get on Zoom as opposed to sort of maintaining those weekends? So I'm thinking maybe let's go with Quincy because she's been an essential worker, and then go to Korie, and then Christian, and then B. So Quincy, what are your thoughts about virtual workspaces given that you're an essential worker?
I wish I could access virtual workspaces more often and still get paid for it. Being an essential worker, I've had to be on the front lines. I've had to go grocery shopping. I work for the elderly and the disabled. Not necessarily, you don't have to be elderly to be in our company, but if you've had like a car accident at a young age and you're no longer able to take care of yourself, your family could buy somebody or a company to come in to help you out, to take off the load for them. So that's what I do. So being in my field of work, it was very scary with this pandemic. It was very, what are we gonna do? No one cares about me. I have a 5-year-old daughter downstairs that I need to protect, and I know people who have younger children and who have parents who are facing cancer and different types of ailments. And we really haven't been able to benefit off of Zoom as much as I would like to. We've done, I said 10 meetings, and it kind of all happened in the same week, but for different sites within our company. So it wasn't like 10 meetings for everybody at the same time to learn stuff, to engage, to communicate. It was just, we need to talk to these people, we need to talk to these people, we need to talk to these people. So I never got the pleasure of working from home, really. I still had to deal with the fear and the anxiety of going out into the public and dealing with, shutdowns and curfews. And oh God, when the curfews happened, it's crazy because I had to deal with the curfews on top of the racism, on top of the pandemic. So I worked night shifts starting at 11 p.m. The curfew in Columbus started at 10 p.m. If you didn't have papers saying you could go to where you're going, you could technically be arrested. Our company didn't give out papers until 2 weeks after that memo. It's like they put people of color, me, in a very dangerous situation. I don't mind getting pulled over by the cops, right? If I know I'm not going to get killed. Does that make sense? Like, I think it's just the bare minimum. So I don't think the essential worker jobs are protecting their essential workers at all, especially their people of color, anybody that stands outside of being essentially just like essentially white. So my boundaries, when people have asked me to do Zoom meetings, it's still very territorial for me because this is my only time where I'm at home with my kid, where I'm just allowed to be myself and not worry about everything bad that's going on outside of these walls. So my boss would call me, hey, we have 3 Zoom meetings today. It's very exhausting on me on top of the, 90 hours a week I'm putting in because of my pandemic. So for me, Zoom meetings, they are accessible, they are reliable, they're helpful, but still, I'm still having to deal with the physicality of my job. So it doesn't necessarily take away from my stresses. It just actually adds to it.
Korie, how's this switch been for you with the type of job that you have?
It's been challenging. I working in higher education, working in an institution. We had to transition to remote very quickly. It was finals week of winter quarter when all of this happened. So our students did not experience anything very well. Faculty only had a week to learn how to do everything remotely. And then we jumped right back into classes. And for us, we had a lot of programs that we were planning on doing that got put on hold because our students were just burnt out and upset and tired. And the 9 students that we're supervising, like the students, our incoming interns who are part of our practicum course that we were preparing for them, like when all of them were feeling the way they were, we were magnifying that by more than 30,000 students. Like it was a lot to take in. People still also experiencing transphobia on our campus and experiencing just microaggressions in the middle of a pandemic because our international student population is pretty high. It was just there was so much happening. And I felt like between that and also working for a unit that's focused on equity, diversity, and inclusion, but that same unit is also making me, write about what I'm doing day to day, just so they can advocate for me to keep my job. Like that was really exhausting. It's eye-opening that people don't care about equity until it matters as well, right? Like my job wasn't in question anymore when Black Lives Matter started trending too. So like I'm experiencing this all firsthand, being Black and also working for a unit of equity, diversity, and inclusion, and having to navigate what my students are feeling, but also my own feelings, having to put my feelings aside for work and sitting on Zoom all day, every day, meeting after meeting at my kitchen table, because my computer chair is not set up in an optimal way. No ergonomic setup in here. Like it's just, I just had to get used to it. And I'm very grateful to work for UCSD for this moment because of being able to have a stable job and being able to continue what I'm doing. And it's a privilege for me to complain, like 100%. But it also doesn't feel at the same time like this is going to be a consistent luxury, because it's like everything I've worked for, like I have to kind of start over again and do it virtually now. And some things are not transferable. Some things are not it's not one and the same. It's not tit for tat, And so it's really difficult, I guess, to work remotely, but I'm really fortunate for it. So
Christian, what has your experience been in this wild moment?
A lot of the same things that both Quincy and Korie have already said, and I'm sure B will echo it the same way. Having the luxury and the privilege of being virtual, but also having to consistently be available for different things, having back-to-back Zoom meetings, and then even with teaching and still being available for students and making sure that they are having an optimal learning experience, and still trying to balance equity on one side and equity for them, and making sure they're still learning, and then making sure you're getting what you're getting. The emotional labor of also being in class during a pandemic, both racial and health-wise, and still dealing with that as well too. That is exhausting. It's just, I'm happy that to be employed. I'm very grateful for the university for that, to have the opportunity to do this and not only be employed virtually, but also to be able to leave the state where I'm working and work somewhere else so that I can feel safer. I appreciate all of that, but it is exhausting. It's a lot more work, a lot more trying to balance, and a lot more being available. And even though, they tell us like your computer, you should be able to log off at 5, still having people text you and call you and, oh, I had a meeting, or, oh, I need this, and I hate to disturb you, but they need all of that done, because to them, you can get on the computer, tap it out, bang it out, and then go. But to be here, and then your family's wondering why you're locked up in a room all day and they don't have access to you. So it's both difficult and privileging all at the same time.
Yeah. B, what's your experience been like, especially being just across the US from like family and just, I don't know, community?
Yeah, very similar to what y'all have said. Like, I privileged to be working from home, and it's, yeah, I wish I could, go back to California. I think I would feel much safer. But it's interesting because, so before before the transition to online, I feel like I was still having these conversations about how trans instructors are perceived. And so there's already these things that happen in the classroom for me, where I experience, on top of racism and these other microaggressions, when students see a trans instructor, they like, the entitlement is just so different. So the entitlement to my space, to just my labor, is different online, and almost probably more intense, because if I'm not immediately available, students will complain to someone higher up, and that higher up person will reach out to me, and it's a trip to me. So I'm like, I'm trying to make space in class to have these conversations about things that are occurring in the real world, and y'all just assume it doesn't apply to me. So it's super frustrating. So it's definitely has intensified in those ways, because that did happen to me recently. And it's frustrating because that doesn't go away, even though I'm at home teaching online. There's like another pressure to be even more responsive to students, and if I don't, they'll kind of show me how powerful they are, I guess, by doing these things that keep me in check in a way. And it's just it's hard to. The only ways I try to set boundaries are to like stay away from email, but that's not really the best thing to do when I am expected to be super responsive.
Yeah, I definitely have been thinking about a lot of these things in the context of like Amazon delivery turnarounds, right? With all of its problems, I think that those problems actually illuminate a lot of what is expected in this moment of sort of like, we expect social justice, and I say we as like, you know, a randomized we, but there's an expectation for social justice, for the labor of QT POC and BIPOC, for essential workers, right? To sort of be able to offer deliverables to the white elite in ways that don't necessarily take into account the fact that we need time to recharge, and like we need time to step away, and we are not just our jobs or the like work that we do, right? And so my second to last question, I think for the sake of time, what I'll do is actually ask this of Quincy is, so we are obviously all using technologies that are built in some ways to make things accessible for folks, but there's also a real way in which technology is not built or made for everyone. And I'm thinking here about, right, like something as simple as sort of who appears on a Zoom call, right? Like who appears on a cell phone camera, like what face like recognition software or like motion sensor technology, right, also has kind of racist ideologies embedded within it. And for Quincy, since you've talked about like posting your makeup looks online, and I know we've talked about this before, I would love if you kind of give us just like a snapshot of sort of how you, as a Black woman who does makeup, how you have to make the technology work for you in order for sort of you to have like the same representation or visibility that we would see for other folks that doesn't require that same amount of labor and time.
Right. So with makeup, I mean, good Lord, with makeup, it's, for me as a woman of color, the lighting isn't even just the issue. It's also just having access to colors that come off well on my skin. So that's going to be the first step. So having access to that, the right foundation color, you know, pigments of eyeshadow that don't look ashy on me or just washed out. I've noticed like a lot of the tutorials on Instagram and Twitter are on white skin. So it's very easy to put any shade on there and it looks how they want it to look. You don't have to manipulate it. You know, you don't have to turn the overhead lights off and put a spotlight on you to make the colors pop the way that they should pop. So for me, trying to capture my art in my form of makeup is difficult. Like even right now on my Zoom call, I have like a ring light, you know, facing towards me, because natural light at this time of day in my room, the way that it's hitting my window is not going to flatter me. And so I don't want to be just like this black shadow, you know, with just eyes and teeth that appear to people, you know. So a very good example of this recently just happened a couple of days ago was the Simone Biles Vogue cover. You know, they did not properly light that young lady the way that accentuates her beauty. They made her very dull. They made her clash with the background. They did not care about the fact that she has pigment in her skin that bounces well with certain colors, oranges, yellows, vibrant greens, and blues. They put a dull gold for some reason. And I just didn't understand it. It was like a bronze. And so it made her look very dark. And you could see in her facial expressions how unhappy she was. I've never seen someone as a model, as a Vogue cover, as a celebrity, look so distraught in their pictures as they're just taking them. She should feel beautiful. She's on the cover of Vogue. And I felt her emotion off of those pictures. And I can resonate with that. There's so many instances in Hollywood where, oh, the makeup artist didn't know how to do my makeup. The hair person didn't know how to do my hair. The lighting was all off. They didn't even have a spotlight on me because they feel like putting a spotlight on a Black person gives them too much attention. When in reality, we just want to be seen equally as the other people who are equally lighted on stage. So even in these Zoom calls, I mean, if it was a gloomy day in Columbus, a Zoom call was not going to be my best day, you know? I had to work towards the lighting, and even with in-house lighting, it still is very unflattering. So for me, it's about timing, it's about lighting, it's about positioning, and just to make my skin look good. I think that that's very depreciated, you know?
Yeah.
And it's made fun of a lot when some people don't have access to figuring this type of stuff out, or even, you know, putting the effort or caring about it, because I'm just going to join the Zoom call, do my job, and move on. But, oh, well, we can't see you. They make little microaggressions. Turn your light up. It's like, I can't do there's no flash on the front camera of an iPad or a computer. There's nothing I can do. So the fact that white skin or lighter skin comes off better, how am I supposed to help that? So I definitely know that there is a distinction in trying to present yourself as who you are when it comes to these Zoom calls. You know, you want to be seen, you want to be heard. And if it's just a shadow, it's just more reason to not see you as who you are in a Zoom call. And I can imagine how many people have been disregarded because their lighting isn't up to par with everyone else's.
Yeah, with that, thank you for that answer, Quincy. I think that's a really important part that people don't even think about, right? Because it gets into questions of visibility, of like who can be visible even on a technological level. So final questions, just to kind of wrap up. And I, again, appreciate so much your time and just like your energy to this, like what felt, I think in a lot of ways, we've gone through a lot of emotions in this conversation too, of just like ways in which for me, I feel like there was a lot of healing, at least for me, and I appreciate you all being here. And so my final question, and you can kind of choose which of these you want to go with, but for the skeptical part of you, the question I would have is like, you know, given that social media is like other industries and tools owned by major corporations, right? Do you ever find that you are skeptical of sort of what's possible for BIPOC and QTPOC online? And do you feel that there are limitations that are imposed that can be really hard to overcome because it's sort of like the one or the collective versus larger corporate power? Or sort of the more optimistic, hopeful question would be like, what role does social media play as sort of a final statement in helping to bring us closer to a radical future of some kind? Like what are some of the steps that you see yourself or others taking in order to get us closer to that? And like what possibilities maybe exist because of social media? So big questions that allow for big or small wrap-up statements, but let's maybe go with B, and then Quincy, and then Christian, and then Korie. And I've been doing this so I can try to remember who goes at what time. So final thoughts.
I think I'm definitely skeptical for sure, because I think about the shadow banning and also the algorithm, the racism in the algorithm. And I mean, just the way that certain things are filtered. So I'm thinking about Instagram specifically and Facebook too, in that that you can't even say certain phrases online.
Yeah.
So you can't say men are trash. Or if you do on your personal page, then someone will report it. So I'm definitely skeptical in those ways, because I know that pretty much I can't say anything online because ultimately it does get removed. And so I'm still skeptical, but I think that there are a lot of dope folks that are just really making this radical future possible and accessible online. And I think the ways in which they do that is by building community on their platforms, and I think taking it outside and beyond social media. Like when thinking of just organizing, and as well as just like I'm thinking of Veggie Mijas and the ways in which they'll connect with folks, or so like vegans or vegetarians online, and then they will take that outside of that social media space and will meet in a community to cook food together. So those are the ways that I'm thinking that this is definitely a possibility in the future. I am always skeptical and frustrated though by the limitations. But I think we're definitely starting to get there. I think it's possible. There are ways to beat the algorithm, and I've seen folks do that successfully, even if that's having to post selfies first and then post a bunch of resources just to kind of one up the algorithm in those ways.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you, B. I feel like on top of what you just said, the algorithms are created by people who don't represent the masses. We didn't put prejudice in it on purpose. We didn't do this. But did you include any other voices outside of white voices? Did you include any other voices outside of cis voices, outside of heterosexual, outside of Christian, even whatever, did you include anybody outside of your box that makes you uncomfortable? And so I'm on the skeptical side as well. It's very hard to see positivity when you are the one being oppressed 24/7. I feel like I can't say anything online as well. It feels like a censorship in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not even a censorship of the people we're going against. It's a censorship of the people that are supposedly on the same side as us, You can't say anything without offending anybody nowadays. And I definitely think that social media, the higher ups, the ones who control it, such as TikTok and the way that they, quote unquote, didn't shadow ban Black Lives Matter tags and didn't, they, whatever, we're not going to say it, but we know what's up. But it's very interesting to see what movements are being silenced versus what movements are not. I still see very racist stuff, very homophobic, transphobic, xenophobic, and it's just the people who are speaking out against it are the ones being minimalized, the ones who are being, well, you shouldn't say that. That's very, very violent of you to say that. Black lives don't matter. It's like, calm down. Like it hurts to see that because this is our one platform that we have, any social media platform that we choose to say it on, even Facebook censors a lot of that type of stuff. So it sucks to have to be skeptical, but I feel like if I were to just give all optimism and hope to the cause, I feel like that's foolish as well, because look at where we are in 2020. All the hopefuls, all the wishful thinkers, daydreamers, peaceful, whatever. Look at where we are still. Nothing has worked on left, right, extremist sides. Nothing has come together. So I definitely think social media stopping us from doing that is a problem, and it's going to continue to separate us.
So same to everything else. The only thing I really have to add, because they've said it so eloquently. The only thing I have to add is that I guess for my hopefulness for social media comes not only for access, but it also comes from the youth. More so watching how like K-pop stands like infiltrated stuff, or like whether that was true or not. Like with the Trump rally, kind of amped up. So like having the youth and having them like, okay, well, we're going to use social media to not let people be dicks online. Gives me a little bit of hope, because if that's how they show their activism, by taking down races or by making sure races don't have their spaces, that gives me hope for the future as far as social media and technology and coming together to use that as activism. So that fuels my spark of hope when the babies come out and they do that and they're like, yeah, we got you. We're going to troll these people who are trolling you.
I love it. Korie, no pressure, but final thoughts.
K-pop stands are scary. No, I'm kidding. I'm pretty skeptical of social media. This whole pandemic has made me like rethink even using it. If I'm being quite honest, when I saw so many people sharing just images of death and all these things happening to the Black community, I was like, I need a break. Like, I had so many like white people come out the woodwork, send me messages like, who I haven't spoke to, and they're just like, yeah, like, I hope you're okay. And I'm like, Okay.
No.
Like, thanks. I appreciate I appreciate you took the time to reach out, but I don't want to talk right now. Like, I don't want to tell you, like, yeah, like, life is great. Like, a Black person, am okay. And so social media it makes me feel very, like, skeptical. Like, just in general, like, I have no urge now to, like, I don't want to know what's happening in the world, like, between cancel culture, between, like, everything that's happening. I'm like, everyone is deeply problematic, and social media is just heightening that. Like, because you can say what you want with little to no repercussions, except the fact you'll probably get canceled or dragged online, and then people will forget about it 2 months later. Like, and as far as my hope goes, I'm glad it brings people together. But at the same time, I'm also not, because you bring all these people together in these virtual spaces, and then something implodes, and then you get all these solidarity statements. You get all of these, like, it's like people are constantly trying to reinvent the wheel for something that can't be reinvented, I guess. And, like, I'm just tired. And that's just kind of where I'm at. Like, 2020 for me is just, I'm tired. And I think moving forward, especially when this eventually ends, right? And I know this won't end for people right away when the pandemic ends, or racism isn't going anywhere anytime soon. Like, but when things start to develop a sense of normalcy again, I want people to remember how they acted during this time. I want people to remember their social media usage during this time. And I want people to take a step back from the screen, take a step back from, I don't know, just not being good to their fellow humans. Like, that's all I can hope for, I guess. But I know that's a tall order in this day and age. Be nice to each other at all whatsoever. But
Okay. This one.
I think we have extra audio from Quincy.
Okay.
Sorry, someone was at my door. I'm sorry. I'll handle that. Thank you. I thought it was biased. I was so sorry.
So just to kind of wrap everything together, I want to again say how much I appreciate you all in this long conversation, right? I feel like when I was trying to put all these questions together, I was like, this will be fine. We won't have a lot to say. And then Brady was like, okay. And
Sure, Jan.
And I think, right, exactly. And I think that what's beautiful though about this conversation is that, like, you know, Quincy and Korie know each other. You know, I obviously know all of y'all, but like, we didn't have sort of a formal introduction between everybody before this moment. And to see how, like, dynamic this conversation is, and just thinking about the fact that we are all currently spread out across the US in places that, like, well, except for Korie, like, we really don't want to be. But that being said, like, I just want to emphasize again how much I appreciate this time and this labor, because it is labor to also talk about these things that have real pain attached to them. And I appreciate how much that you all were willing to, like, answer my Instagram DMs and my emails, and just to be here and present in this space. I appreciate you. And I hope that you have, like, enjoyed this time together as much as I've enjoyed, just selfishly seeing my friends, but also I'm really excited about the fact that, like, once this is up on YouTube, that everybody will get to hear your brilliance, you know, as we continue to be in pandemic time. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you for inviting us, honestly. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yes, thank you for having me. And it was so nice to meet all of you and to listen to you.
I loved hearing you talk, Christian. Oh my God, thank you.
Like